Throughout the month of November, we have been exploring generosity as a sign and that we are alive in faith. 2 weeks ago, we focused on those in our past who had modeled generosity for us and reflected on the impact they had on who we are and how we live today. And last week, we turned to our own lives, acknowledging our blessings and recalling that we are to discover how each of us is to contribute to the coming reign of God through the ministries that are close to our particular hearts. We live generously through sharing our time, talent, and treasure. So today, then, we turn to the future. Who do we hope that our generosity will inspire, support, and transform? We heard from Willa that her giving to Imagine No Malaria for her is about protecting and having children in Africa be able to reach their potential that we can't even imagine or know what will be, and yet giving gives God the opportunity to continue to use them. We've heard from Dr. Kwan about how our giving has continued to support the School of Theology, and the kinds of leadership coming out of that will lead the church far beyond the present of most of us living here today. Giving towards the future takes the largest leap of faith because it calls us to relinquish control to God, trusting that God will be working in the lives of those to come, even though it might look and be quite different than the way God is working through us. Now, there's a story that circulated a number of years ago about a woman who named Denise, who used to shop at the same grocery store every week. One day she got out of her car in the supermarket lot, and she noticed in the car parked next to hers that a woman was in the driver's seat. Her arms draped over the steering wheel, and her head was resting on her arms. Her eyes were tightly closed. She was not moving a muscle. She was perfectly still. Now, there was a lot of thoughts that ran through Denise's mind, thinking, well, it looked a little odd, and she did wonder if the woman was okay, whether she was sick. Maybe she'd had a heart attack. Was she had a stroke? Was she fainted? But then she thought, well, maybe she's just resting or sleeping, or maybe she's praying. And she got stuck in that dilemma of whether to do anything or not, and so she decided that actually she would just go in to do her grocery shopping, and she would check when she came back to see what the situation was. Well, it was about 45 minutes till Denise got back, and when she did, immediately she noticed that the woman was in exactly the same position. So now Denise was really concerned, was feeling quite guilty. She hadn't done anything, and so she knocked on the window of the car. Nothing, no response. Now, at this point, Denise probably should have gone to get some security officer, but instead she wanted to help, and so she tried the door, and it was open. So she opened the car door, and she said to the woman, "Are you all right?" And she heard this weak little voice say, "I've been shot. I've been shot in the neck." Well, now, Denise couldn't figure it out because she said there was no signs of foul play, there was no blood anywhere, there was no bullet holes that she could see in the car windows. So Denise examined the woman's neck on the left side and saw nothing, and she looked around and looked at the front of her neck and she could see nothing. So then she ran around the other side of the car, got in the passenger side, looked at the right side of the neck. Again, there was nothing. So she got on her knees on the passenger side car and looked over the back of the woman's neck. And there Denise discovered the problem. Now, there wasn't a bullet or a gunshot wound. Rather, she discovered an uncooked Pillsbury biscuit stuck to the woman's neck. Denise looked in the back seat, and there on the top of the woman's grocery sack was an exploded can of Pillsbury biscuits. And one had obviously been propelled into the back of the woman's neck, hitting her. Now, when Denise told the woman she had been shot, not been shot at all, but rather been hit by a flying biscuit, the woman did not believe her. So Denise peeled the biscuit off the back of her neck and showed it to her. Well, the woman, after very meekly and somewhat embarrassedly saying, "Thank you," drove off as soon as she could get Denise out of her car. Now, you think about that story for a minute. First of all, what does it say in the world in which we live that somebody, a woman who hears a thud in the back of her neck and her first thought is, "I've been shot"? But also, I think the story reminds us of the sad fact that there are many people who give up and quit on life, who are emotionally and spiritually like that woman in the car, paralyzed, afraid to move, to ask for help, afraid to explore options. They feel powerless and immobile, helpless and hopeless. They believe they've been mortally wounded and become afraid to move, afraid to act, afraid to love. They give up and they give in. There's no energy, there's no strength, there's no fire, there's no passion, because they're spiritually and emotionally paralyzed by their perceptions of what's happening in their lives. Well, for such people, generosity is difficult because of the fear in their lives. And for them to be able to think about generations yet to come and being generous towards them is almost impossible, because they've lost the zest and the meaning of life. They've given up control of their lives, not to God, but to fear. Now, there's a number of ways to fight this type of paralysis, I think, and we discover a couple different models in our scripture lessons this morning. The first would be to respond in some ways like the Pharisee did in our parable from Luke. We attempt to take complete charge of our lives. We refuse to give in to circumstance, but we do everything in our control in order to order our lives. We strive to be righteous. We strive to be faithful today and for tomorrow. We follow the rules and the expectations. But there's a danger in this way of fighting paralysis and fear. We become like the Pharisee who says, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Everything the Pharisee says is true. He has set himself apart from others by his faithful adherence to the law. He is, by the standards both Luke and Jesus seem to employ, righteous. And before we judge him too quickly, we might reframe his prayer slightly and wonder if we have also uttered it at some point. Maybe we haven't said, Lord, thank God I'm not like those people. But maybe on seeing someone down on their luck or having a hard time, we might say to ourselves, well, there, but for the grace of God go I. And think about your reaction to the story about the lady in her car. I mean, don't you hope you wouldn't just sit there unable to move, unable to imagine some way to call for help in order to discover what had actually happened? You see, it isn't that the Pharisee is speaking falsely, but rather that the Pharisee misses the true nature of his blessings. As Luke states in the introductory sentence, the Pharisee trusted in himself. His prayer of gratitude may be directed to God, but it's really all about himself. He locates his righteousness entirely in his own actions and being. And with such thinking, we begin to perceive that what we give is also our own and not a blessing to be shared. We assess others on their worthiness of our gifts, and we withhold or we give in a spirit of judgment rather than in a spirit of joy. Now, the Pharisee is not a bad person, but in trusting in his own righteousness, he's likely to run out of joy and generosity towards others, towards life in general, and particularly if life throws him a curveball. When we live as if we have to prove or earn our righteousness, when challenges come, we often work harder and try more and more, but then we begin to find ourselves exhausted and without joy. And suddenly we can find ourselves paralyzed, just like the biscuit lady, believing that God has somehow failed us. Well, another way to fight paralysis in life is to place our whole trust in the living God who has been, who is, and who will ever be at work in creation. The tax collector in our parable comes before God awed by the power and the presence of the Holy One, seeking mercy. The tax collector knows that he possesses no means by which to claim righteousness. He's done nothing of merit. In fact, he's done much to offend the law of Israel. For this reason, he stands back, hardly daring to approach the temple, and he throws himself on the mercy of the Lord. And herein is the essential contrast between the Pharisee and the tax collector. One makes a claim of righteousness based on his own accomplishments, while the other relies entirely on God's benevolence. Rather than be grateful for his blessings, the Pharisee appears smug to the point of despising others. In his mind, there are two kinds of people, the righteous and the immoral, and he's grateful that he's placed himself among the righteous. But David Lose writes, the tax collector, on the other hand, isn't so much humble as he is desperate. He's too overwhelmed by his plight to take time to divide humanity into sides. All he recognizes as he stands near the temple is his own great need. He therefore stakes his hopes and claims not on anything he has done or deserved, but entirely on the mercy of God. In our reading from 2 Timothy, Paul sounds a bit like the Pharisee. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on there is reserved for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. But as you read further, we also hear the tax collector in Paul's words, as he is sure it is God who has brought him through all of life. He writes, the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, that through me the message might be fully proclaimed. To God be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul's not praising his own gifts, his own abilities, and his own good works. In whatever ways Paul has been faithful, he ultimately knows he has accomplished what he's done by the power of the Spirit working through him, and that God is the one who deserves all glory and honor. So when you and I actively participate in the mission of Christ's church, living generously, not to earn our salvation, but in response to the glory and the grace of God in our lives, then we come alive with hope and joy and possibility. When we touch into the heart of the tax collector, coming before God in humility, aware of God's generosity in our lives, we give light and love, trusting in God's faithfulness. Life may well have challenges for us, but we will not become paralyzed by them like the biscuit lady. When we trust that all we have is a gift of God, when we experience God's generosity towards us, then we'll not only care for those in our time, but we'll also live for those that are yet to come. We will plant seeds that will bear fruit even after we're long gone. The Talmud, which is an important rabbinical book in Judaism, includes this wonderful tale called Hani and the Carob Tree. It goes like this. Hani was a small boy and he saw an old man planting a carob tree. Hani asked him, how long will it take the tree to bear fruit? 70 years, says the old man. Will you live long enough to eat from the tree? Inquired Hani. Probably not, said the old man. Well, then why bother? And the old man replies, when I was young, I enjoyed many trees that were planted by my father and my grandfather. Just as they planted trees for me, I am planting trees for my children and all the others who will follow me. Yesterday, I joined Rachel Youngstrom's team, Rachel's Rainbows, at the One Walk at the Rose Bowl, an effort to raise funds for research into type 1, for causes and cures for type 1 diabetes. Now, I asked Rachel if I could share some of her story this morning, and she said I could. Rachel, you see, was diagnosed just a little over a year ago with type 1 diabetes, just as she was about to begin school. She and her parents, Chris and Donna, had a lot to learn about how to live with diabetes, managing insulin levels, exercise, and food choices. This disease often means that children have to take on pretty serious adult-like responsibilities to know how to keep themselves well. Just trying to balance all that's required to keep Rachel healthy would have been enough for most of us to do. But instead of focusing only on herself, Rachel, along with her parents, invited others to make a difference for everyone living with type 1 diabetes. She committed to walk now in order to raise money so that children in the future will have an easier time with juvenile diabetes. Maybe even finding a cure for it. Rachel, with more than a little help from her parents, didn't get paralyzed by her diagnosis. They also aren't only consumed with it for today. Despite the challenges that still exist for her and their family, they are creating a legacy of generosity as they support research for the future. And when I was pastoring at the neighborhood in Long Beach, we received word that a gift was coming to us. It was a very substantial donation and one we desperately needed for our after-school children's program. Well, interestingly enough, the person who left the gift had passed away 30 years before and hadn't even been at First United Methodist Church Long Beach for 20 years before that. But his last surviving family member had died, and the remainder of the trust was being divided to 3 churches in which the family had been involved throughout their lives. What struck me about this gift was that the family hadn't even been in the church for over 50 years. I couldn't find a single person who remembered anything about them. But they planned to share their resources with whoever was at that church when the time came. And they did it with no controls. They indicated they were partial to children and youth ministry, but they noted that the money could be used in whatever was the current and most greatest need. Their generosity was complete relinquishment of control and a sign of complete trust in God. The same trust that the tax collector and Paul demonstrated. The ministry and mission at First United Methodist Church Long Beach looked nothing like it had when that family had participated. But they gave to whatever mission and ministry there would be. They understood what they had as a gift from God and offered it back without condition to the future work that God would do. Sisters and brothers, God's grace and mercy have been a cup overflowing in our lives. In gratitude, we respond as people fully alive, living generously now and planting seeds for the future. So like the tax collector, we can stand before God in awe, and like Paul, live in a calm surrender to hope, not an unrealistic hope, but one which dares to believe that ultimately there is a living and loving God, and we do not need fear. May God help us to move beyond being people with Pillsbury biscuits stuck to the back of our necks to people who plant carob trees for those who will come after us. Amen.